Come on in, welcome to Idle Now, where we talk all things Survivor. My name is Luke, and today we're talking about the 10 biggest targets on returning player seasons. Returning player seasons are an exciting prospect for Survivor fans. Fans spend years pondering what it would be like if their favorite players from their favorite seasons interacted. What happens, they wonder, when you put Boston Rob and Russell on an island together? Sandra and Tony? Jeff Varner and Zeke? Okay, scratch that last one. Returning players are usually pretty exciting, but just by the nature of prior reputations and relationships, there's no way for them to be a pure or fair Survivor experience. Some players just come into the game with a reputation that precedes them by a lot, resulting in a target on their back that is sometimes insurmountable. Whatever the reason, sometimes returning players on Survivor enter with massive targets on their back that make them the target of everyone and their mother. Which players had the biggest targets coming into returning player seasons, and how did they do? Let's find out. All that said, let's count down the 10 biggest returning player targets ever in Survivor history. At number 10 is Cass in Survivor Cambodia. Of all the full returning player seasons, Second Chance was the most balanced just by virtue of its theme. 20 players who never won playing for the second time. Still, there were big targets heading into this season, namely Spencer, Cirie, and Fishbach, whose know-it-alliness threatened nearly everyone. But the player with the biggest target heading into that season was undoubtedly Chaos Cass. Cass had a lot stacked against her right away. For one, she calls herself Chaos Cass, but also she was a big character on a recent and popular season, with a reputation for flipping on her alliances and flipping off her enemies. I cannot underline enough how much preseason discussion just took it as gospel that Cass would not survive a single tribal council. Almost every preseason boot prediction had Cass going first or second, and Cass herself did not think she was long for the game. In her campaign to get on the season, Cass argued that she's changed and learned how to communicate better, but it always came with a very Cass-esque wink and a nod. In the actual game, Cass played entirely differently, however, laying low and making sincere social connections, but her game was cut short at the merge when she just landed on the wrong side of the numbers after saving Spencer Bot at the second swap, only for him to return the favor by voting her out at the next tribal council in what ends up being a very frustrating elimination. Wow, and I thought he was on his way to becoming a real boy. Did Geppetto teach you nothing? At number 9 is Tom in Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. At the time of Heroes vs. Villains, Tom had played probably the most dominant game in Survivor history. He was the de facto leader of the most successful tribe ever, leading a team with Katie, Janu, Karen, and Willard on it to a perfect pre-merge immunity challenge record. He won 5 individual immunities himself, was a great social player in his own right, and he averted every possible coup attempt that threatened his win, and then guilt-tripped Ian into handing him $1 million at the final immunity challenge. Tom's Palau game is a sight to behold, and everyone on Heroes vs. Villains knew it. Tom was also not well connected in the Survivor community, meaning that outside of Stephanie, who he'd played with before, he didn't have anyone really watching his back once they hit the beach. It's fitting that the Heroes camp early on divides largely into 2 groups, Tom's team and Cirie's team, because they were by far the 2 biggest targets on this tribe. I'd put Cirie's threat level just a tad below Tom's, but both were respected and feared. Unfortunately for Tom, the Heroes' early game losing streak put him on the defensive right away, and unfortunately for Tom and Cirie, Tom wins the battle against Cirie, but her side ultimately wins the war, as they go out 4th and 5th respectively. A Heroes tribe with either of these 2 at the helm might have stood a chance at the merge, but instead the brains of this operation fell to JT.
You writing your letter to Russell, buddy?
Yeah.
At number 8 is Sandra in Survivor Winners at War. There were a lot of massive targets in Winners at War: Parvati, Kim, Tyson, Tony, Sarah, but there's only one woman this season who's won the game twice. Sandra had proven in her first 2 games that she could play the anybody but me game better than anyone, and her third showing in Game Changers was impressive in its own right, showing that she also had the ability to play a strategically aggressive game too. Honestly, is there anything she can't do? Besides challenges, I mean? Going into Winners at War, I think almost everyone expected Sandra to be one of the first few voted out, because everyone on this cast wanted to dethrone the Queen. And Sandra had kinda made this her whole brand, rocking tiaras at reunions and saying "Queen stays Queen" roughly every single time she was on screen in Game Changers. She'd postured herself as the Survivor legend, rightfully so. But in the game, that just meant everyone wanted to go all Jon Snow and be the Queen Slayer. Plus, how embarrassing would it be if they had a season guaranteed to produce another 2-time winner, and instead Sandra just becomes a 3-time winner? Sandra actually plays super well the entire pre-swap portion of the game, and largely stays off the radar, but it's always the swap that screws her. At post-swap to call, Sandra severely overvalues her fire tokens to like an NFT degree, and sells Denise her immunity idol for 2 fire tokens, only to get idled out by Denise with her own idol. Yeah, that was just a little too cute by half, I'm sorry to say. But whatever, this is still the only monarchy in the world worth acknowledging. At number 7 is Tony in Survivor Game Changers. Due to the, let's say, imbalanced nature of the Game Changers cast, the actual Game Changers were always going to be targeted first by the alleged Game Changers. But the most recent winner on the cast, Tony, was a special case. Tony's first game was chaotic, to say the least. He made and broke alliances, spied on his allies, found and weaponized idols, and seemingly never slept. It was all of the above that made Tony one of the biggest targets on Game Changers. He was known as an advantage-finding, chaos-creating, llama-speaking madman who somehow pulled out a win. I also don't think it's unreasonable to say that a lot of this cast's more random selections felt a little insecure next to massive Survivor legends, and wanted to prove their game-changiness by taking down the trophy bucks. Tony's target was so big, he was getting targeted by people not even on this cast. Russell Hantz was, let's say, heavily rumored to be coaching Caleb to target both Tony and Sandra. Sandra for obvious reasons, and Tony, I assume, because he played a Russell-style strategic game, while also having a social game. You can see the Russell influence all over Caleb's pre-game press, although, ironically, Caleb would be one of the only people on Tony's side by day 4. On the season, Tony played into his reputation by running off into the woods 5 seconds into the game, a joke which no one was laughing at, and which resulted in a 19th place finish that set the season on a downward trajectory it would never recover from. Well, thanks, Russell. At number 6 is Sandra again in Survivor Game Changers. Going into Game Changers, Sandra was the number 1 target hands down. As Survivor's only 2-time winner at the time, Sandra would be the ultimate get. I don't think anyone was particularly afraid of her going into Heroes vs. Villains, despite her being a 1-time winner then, but now everyone officially knew. You don't win Survivor twice on accident. It's honestly wild. Sandra went from being one of the lower target returnees on her second season to the biggest target on her third. And taking down the Queen of Survivor would be quite the feather in the cap for a lot of this cast who desperately wanted to prove they deserve the moniker of Game Changer, which is way better than what most Survivor fans called them before, which was, who? On the show, Sandra showed why she's Sandra. In both her initial tribe and her first post-swap tribe, Sandra was basically running the show, well insulated at the center of the tribe both times and taking down the other big threats left and right, leaving her with an army of Mana's most manipulatable. Unfortunately, her luck ran out when a second swap did not break in her favor, and she and Varner were swapped to a tribe outnumbered by a pretty united Nuku supermajority. It's truly heartbreaking. Sarah, Ty, Andrea, Zeke, and Ozzy get to be the ones to finally vote out the Queen. I mean, come on, this is like if Thanos was killed by Pepper Potts. At number 5 are Boston Rob and Amber in Survivor Winners at War. Had either played this season solo, their targets would not be as huge. Amber's would be pretty small, and Rob would drop down a few pegs from top of the list to below Sandra and Parvati, in my opinion. But together, a husband and wife team of Survivor royalty were the biggest targets in the Oops All Targets season. And duh, Rob of course plays an incredibly dominating game where you're either with him or against him, where things don't tend to work out well for those who are against him. And oh yeah, there's a giant statue of his head visible from camp. Amber's also a really skilled under-the-radar social player in her own right. They're legit Survivor royalty with their own built-in alliance and lots of friends on the season. And remember how they already ran an all-star season top to bottom previously? There's no comparison. Romber were top of the hit list in Winners at War, while Rob was seizing control in the early days of Cirie just by doing Boston Rob things. DeCall was doing everything they could to hinder him from across the island. Yule basically invented a fictional alliance to put Rob's wife, best friend, and Kim Spradlin, sure, why not, in the crosshairs, and the tribe wasted no time zapping Rob's power from afar by voting out Amber, then Tyson. Rob's target would prove inescapable at the swap, where on paper he has a majority, but in reality he was swapped with the two people with whom he had the worst working relationship, Ben and Adam. And in a desperate attempt to save himself, Rob tried to bust out the buddy system, but he didn't have any buddies on this tribe. Plainly put, of the first 6 boots on this season, 4 were voted out in part or in full to weaken Rob and Amber. In hindsight, they should have pretended they had no idea who each other is. Boston who? Never heard of him. No, I married Rob Zabachnik. Totally different guy. He spells it with 2 B's.
2 B's, guys.
At number 4 is Parvati in Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. Parvati was by far the biggest target this season. Few players have ever been as feared as she was here. Known for assembling an all-women's alliance that systematically took out all the men post-merge in increasingly embarrassing fashion in Micronesia, Parvati was viewed as having almost supernatural powers of persuasion via seduction, like a siren straight out of ancient Greek mythology, or possibly Austin Powers. Parvati used her sexuality as a weapon, and everyone was afraid of ending up in the Black Widow's web. You can see this play out in the first episode of Heroes vs. Villains. Parvati is basically persona non grata from moment 1, with Randy and Coach wanting to take her out the second the villains lose. But Parvati managed to escape her preordained fate as an early boot with a strategic deal with the devil, or Russell. Russell offered a ride to Parvati on his coattails, but he also turned into a little schoolboy when in her presence, gifting her idols throughout the seasons like he's one of those guys making Twitch donations to his favorite hot tub streamer. Who was playing who? Parvati's deep run in Heroes vs. Villains against insane odds right out of the gate is one of the best non-winning games in history, birthing 10 long years of completely baseless Parvati 2.0 comparisons for any attractive, charming woman under 30, almost all of which are laughable in hindsight. You're trying to tell me Libby is Parvati 2.0? She's barely Libby 1.0. At number 3 is Russell in Survivor Redemption Island. Sometimes tribe captains are going to be well received no matter which tribe they're on. Sometimes some of the new players are going to want them gone, but only Russell was dead in the water before he even drew a buff. With back-to-back 39-day finishes with his back up against the wall for most of his Survivor career, it genuinely seemed like Russell was uneliminatable. He seemingly always had something up his sleeve to bail him out at the 11th hour, an idol, a turn of phrase, Jason socks. And playing for his 3rd time in 4 seasons, no other player had been so saturated in such a short amount of time. Russell was also known as an extremely negative force around camp. He destroyed clothes, hid machetes, told pointless lies, and generally sowed chaos. The thing about his game is, it's very effective when the other players don't know the playbook. But if you run the same plays over and over, eventually the competition will catch on. If he'd waited 5 years before coming back for a third shot, I think Russell might have fared better. But playing for his third time in 2 years, 2 seasons of Russell antics were still very fresh in everyone's mind. It also didn't help him that the other tribe captain this season was Boston Rob. The edit of Heroes vs. Villains was borderline hagiographic to Rob, and directly contrasted him with Russell in a way that made Boston Rob look heroic and Russell selfish and unpredictable. Russell, of course, did himself no favors by trying to run the literal exact same game for the 3rd time in a row, but his goose was cooked the second he said yes to this season. I mean, how screwed was Russell? Even Ometepe would have voted him off first. At number 2 are Rob C, Ethan, Jenna M, and Tina in Survivor All-Stars. As the first returnee season, All-Stars was truly uncharted territory. No one was quite sure how it would go, and it was bound to be messy because many of these players knew each other and were friends with one another. But there was one thing everyone agreed upon: the winners must go first. Well, almost everyone agreed upon that. Not sure the winners were super on board. The pre-merge of All-Stars is defined by the also-rans' belief that the winners had had their shot and that they should all be voted out of their respective tribes first. And Rob Cesternino was legitimately in as much danger as they were. For all intents and purposes, this guy may as well have been a winner. Rob C invented, then perfected the strategy of flip-flopping alliances whenever you're on the bottom, and was widely agreed upon at the time as the best player to never win, a moniker which Probst himself publicly bestowed upon him a few months before All-Stars started filming. Oh, cool. Thanks, Jeff. These 4 players really had no chance in the game. Jenna quit to go be with her dying mother, and as such we didn't get to see much of her game, but Tina was on a small tribe with the most anti-winner player in the game, Jenna, and quickly booted first. Rob C landed on a tribe with most of the cartoon characters and no winners, giving him no one to hide behind, so he was the first one voted out of his tribe. And Ethan fared the best, but he was never able to get his footing in the game. He tried being a provider, tried being a challenge beast, and although he squeaked by longer than the rest, he was ultimately betrayed by his real-life friend, Lex. But hey, it's nothing personal, right, Lex? These 3 winners and Rob C undoubtedly had the biggest targets on their backs of any players in Survivor history. Well, except the biggest returning player target of all time is Richard Hatch in Survivor All-Stars, and it's not even close. The other winner on All-Stars, no one has ever been more dead in the water on Survivor than Survivor's original winner on its first All-Star season. It's a wonder he made it 5 episodes. Richard Hatch was a household name in the year 2000, and the shadow he cast over the franchise loomed large for years. By voting for Rich over Kelly on Season 1, the jury inadvertently rewrote Survivor from a game of who's the nicest and best camper to a game of who's the shrewdest and most cutthroat social strategist. It was one thing that Hatch was Survivor's first winner. It was another thing entirely that it was his rulebook that the foundation of Survivor strategy was built upon. Going into All-Stars, there was no question what was going to happen to Rich. Whenever his first tribal council happens to be, the game will basically pause so that everyone can vote him out. To Rich's credit, he played the only game he could have in All-Stars, as the Fool. In Borneo, Hatch was the strategist. In All-Stars, he didn't strategize until day 15, and even then, barely. Early on, he mostly lounged around, got naked, and gave the other players easy layups to poke fun at his weight or sexuality or shrinkage. Sure, eventually he stepped into the provider role, but by acting as non-threatening as possible early on, Hatch actually gave himself the only slim chance he had of surviving a vote. Honestly, it's like a 10,000 IQ move, and is basically the same strategy Tony used early on in Winners at War when he put himself on house arrest. But also, what did Hatch care? He knew he was toast and he didn't have anything to prove, so why not have fun in whatever his limited number of days might be? Hatch's All-Stars game was all about having fun, and as such was probably one of the least mentally taxing games in the history of this show. And if there's one thing Hatch loves, it's not paying his taxes. Got nothing else for ya. To help me with my YouTube threat level, like and subscribe and I'll get you more Survivor content just like this. Until next time, don't get idled out.